right, let's dive right in. I want to provide you with a global overview of the book. Where is Bill VanPatten going? How is he building up this argument in this book? Chapter 1, he talks about language versus communication. We may at times conflate the two. We may not keep them fully distinguished. So he goes right for the jugular. What is language and what is communication? In chapter 2, he talks about that language develops in an ordered way. Just like a tadpole goes from an egg to hatching and then growing his hind legs and then his front legs, so is language as acquired, in that it has an ordered way. The tadpole cannot grow its arms before its legs, and that applies to language as well. He says that order is not determined or affected by curriculum or effort. Just because we put something in the curriculum or the textbook in chapter 1 doesn't mean that's what they're going to learn in chapter 1, because language is acquired in an ordered way, just like a tadpole goes through its 7 locked-in stages. Michelle. And you need to unmute.
Yeah, I am. And somebody has asked if we could mute everybody. I think you have that power. Francie, I'm not sure if you're getting feedback because of the room that you're in with other people.
Getting a little
but
bit
we're
of
getting some
feedback.
feedback. So
Okay.
if you could just mass
Okay,
mute.
good. I will try. Can't promise anything. But Michelle, why don't you go for
Okay,
chapter
so
3?
well, very simply, it's how does language acquisition happen? What contributes to language acquisition? How do these stages, how are they developed? What are the ingredients that are necessary for language acquisition to take place? And then, of course, what are the implications for teachers in a classroom? Those are some questions to explore. And Francie.
Thank you. You want to go for number 4?
Sure. And he also makes a point, and I sort of suggested this in my little intro, that we have to look at the difference between implicit versus explicit learning. And one of the things that will come up over and over again from chapter 1 and beyond is that language acquisition is an implicit process. That is, it is an unconscious process. It's like breathing or your heart beating. You're not in control of it to the extent that we may think we are as language teachers in a classroom. Many of us, I think, have been trained or have experienced explicit language learning, where we learn vocabulary lists, we learn how to conjugate verbs, we learn what we think are patterns that Bill VanPatten actually suggests do not exist in reality, in a psychological reality. And so when we look at language acquisition, we have to see that it is in fact an implicit process, and that has implications for how we're going to teach it. I'm done.
Thank you. If I had to summarize Bill VanPatten's thesis in one statement, it would be this: language is too abstract and complex to teach and learn explicitly. As such, he says, any approach to language teaching in the classroom must be different from approaches to teaching other subjects. So in the prologue, Bill VanPatten says that in this book, nothing is shared that could be in any shape or form construed as being controversial. Also, he says that the book is not about how or what to teach. Instead, the goal of language acquisition in a nutshell is for teachers to be able to make informed decisions and have realistic expectations of themselves and their students. He says also in the prologue that teachers are informed about many aspects of teaching, but rarely about the nature of communication, language, and acquisition. And these are these 3 big clunks that he really distinguishes in this book. And I'm definitely one of those teachers. In my teacher training, I never once heard anything about language acquisition theory, any of crashing, none of that. So I'm definitely one of them who is just like, what? There is
Mhm.
some theory about this? How exciting. So moving on to chapter 1, where he really dives in. What is language and what is communication? How do they overlap? How are they distinct? So he asks, what is language? He says, and bear with me, this is a lengthy quote. In linguistics, language is an abstract, complex, implicit, mental representation of the formal properties of words, sounds, constraints on sentence structure, meaning, and how these relate to each other. So language is a mental representation, and he then dives in and really looks at what does it mean that language is abstract, complex, and implicit. So he starts off with abstract. He states language is an abstract mental representation, and he starts us off with a verb. We are all taught, and if we were asked, what is a verb? We would all say, oh yeah, it gives that the tense and it's the action and it agrees with the subject and all these things. But VanPatten is able to make an argument in the book over and over again that I won't even try to recreate here. But he basically gets us to the point where we have to agree. We all know what a verb is, yet we have difficulty pinpointing its nature. We simply know one when we see one. Constructs, he continues, such as verbs, nouns, and subjects, are abstract concepts that defy description in everyday terms. And it's these everyday terms that we're using in the classroom all the time. And yet we do these terms a disservice, and it may even create confusion. So language is abstract. He says language is too abstract and complex to be put into neat little rules on the page of a level 1 textbook. What's on textbook pages is not what winds up in anyone's head. As such, rules aren't psychologically real. Michelle, you can elaborate on that.
Well, I think it's actually quite clear in the context of the previous quotes here is that when we try to teach students a language through conjugation of verbs or learning different tenses or memorizing connecting words or memorizing lists of vocabulary, um, that is not how the language is acquired, and it's very piecemeal in the way that it's acquired. And what we think are rules, they actually don't exist because the language is being acquired in its interaction, as Franzi previously had displayed, that interaction between the sounds of the language, between the context of the communicative situation, between the words, between the morphemes, between so many different things are interacting and interplaying with each other that we can't tear that apart and say that these are the rules that govern language in the way that it is acquired, because that is simply not the way it happens. It's far too abstract for us to explain the any number of rules that we could even try to imagine as an explanation for language acquisition.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. So how then do we learn a language? In chapter 1, he says every learner of a language must build an abstract representation of the language being learned over time. And that representation can't be found in textbooks. And here, Bill VanPatten gives us a glimpse into the future, where he's going with the book, where he's going to make a strong argument later on. Language is an abstract representation and we build it over time. Every student has to build this map in their mind of how this language works. And it's not done explicitly, it is something that happens implicitly, but we're going to get there soon. So he goes on, language is an explicit mental representation as complex. It says complex here, Francie. Language is a complex mental representation. It has the complexity maybe akin to an airport where everything from the bathrooms needing to be cleaned to airplanes not falling out of the sky, everything has this complexity. And he uses the example of the fly in the soup. He says, for every single sentence, there is a complex interplay between the words and the syntax and the morphology, phonology, and so on. I can say there is a fly in my soup. I can say there's a fly in my soup. There's a fly in my soup. We always have a literal meaning and we have an intent. There's this complexity going on between all these different pieces. And so he goes on, he says, language is an implicit mental representation. Here it is. Implicit in this context means unconscious. And he makes us the example of this. The book was so compelling, she reread it the same day. Versus, she petted the dog, and when it wagged its tail, she repetted it. We all know that the first sentence works. We can say reread, but repet, we all know is like, that sounds weird. I don't think you can do that in the English language. You have to find a workaround. That is that's an example. This is an example of our implicit knowledge of language that some things work, some things don't work. We often demonstrate implicit knowledge by demonstrating both what we know is possible in a language and what is impossible, even though we can't say why. We may not be able to put our fingers on it. We don't have the, PhD in linguistics to explain it, and yet we just know this works and that doesn't. So we're moving towards the end of the chapter. He has now he's now introducing the term of communication. Language, he says, can form a part of communication, but it is not equivalent to communication. Aha, so they are distinct things. They're not synonymous. He defines, Michelle, would you read the communication
Yes.
definition?
And I would like to gesture this because I have learned that gesturing is a very powerful way to remember concepts, to remember vocabulary. I use gesturing a lot in my class, and I've learned that gesturing this definition is very powerful. So you might want to join me. Communication is the expression, and the interpretation of meaning in a given context for a purpose. So that, again, is different. We can use language in order to communicate. When we acquire language, we will then ultimately use that language in order to communicate, but they are not the same thing. So, Francie.
Thank you. I see Anne has her hand raised. Anne, if you want to unmute yourself, and we need to keep it super short
Yeah.
because
There
we're
was
already
something
over.
I could have done this in the breakout room, but I just remember reading repeated, and it made sense to me. Like if when we taught elementary school, kids are inventing language even in their own language. So repeated is something you might hear with the younger ones and with my foreign students. Absolutely. That's all I was going to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Absolutely. Yep. So, in a nutshell, this is the book in a nutshell. Language is a mental representation. I think of it like a three-dimensional map in the brain that we don't even know we have. Language is a mental representation. It exists in our heads. It is abstract, complex. It is implicit, unconscious, and it is not tied to culture. Communication, on the other hand, is a behavior that happens between people and other entities. It is dependent on context and purpose and is tied to culture. So back to the ultimate summary statement. Language is too abstract and complex to teach and learn explicitly. As such, any approach to language teaching in the classroom must be different from approaches to teaching other subjects. So let's now dive and spend a little bit more time on chapter 2, ordered development. And for me, the key picture was that picture of these tadpoles and that evolution of those tadpoles. And I'm even tempted to put this very image on my preps so I can remember that evolution. Bill VanPatten summarizes the chapter with these two sentences. Language develops in an ordered way. This order is not determined by the curriculum or learners' conscious efforts to acquire language. Let that sink in. And so we have that order development and we have language. And Bill VanPatten just says, just as the development of a tadpole becoming a frog is ordered and constrained, so is language acquisition. We're living in a place and time when maybe we are tempted to think that, oh, well, anyway goes and anything will lead to, all roads lead to Rome. But when we look at nature, it is ordered and it is constrained. A tadpole is not so suddenly going to grow a lion's mane. It is ordered and constrained. Nature has a way of shaping and constraining all aspects of life. We refer to this as ordered development. Now, the thing is, acquisition takes time. And we also live in a time and place when we think we don't have much time and we have report cards and we have reporting and we have, deadlines. But acquisition of language takes time. Does that remind you of a first person's principle? Learning involves patience and time. And Bill VanPatten said, acquisition takes time. In fact, it is slow and piecemeal. And like only he could, he talks about, gives his example of morphemes, these tiny little pieces, the smallest possible version of a word. And in the research that he cites, he says that children who learn English as their first language, with or without instruction, learn the language in this universal order. The first thing children will produce is the ing form, I'm going to the store. Then everything becomes the ed, walked, fought, drank, here we go with irregular verbs, but everything adds the ed to go into the past tense. And then they start acquiring the irregular verbs. So instead of goed, it's now I went. And in the end, they add an S for the third person singular. She plays with me. No matter what we do, no matter what we throw at children, this is that universal order. This order is independent of instruction. It is independent of context. It is independent of what language they learn first, and it is independent of age. So, Michelle.
So yes, so morphemes again are the smallest unit of language that carry meaning. So they are like the S added for third person singular forms, which Franzi went over. And there are other morphemes that as second language teachers, we may be able to call up in our heads, such as if you're a Spanish teacher, it would be masculine, feminine endings of O or A, or a change to an adjective in French to make it a feminine, or to agree with a feminine form. The acquisition of those morphemes, again, is ordered, not just in terms of verbs, but in terms of agreement. Adjectival agreement is another area where we have that same ordered development, that a masculine form will take precedence over the acquisition of a feminine form in languages, and all languages that have a distinction between masculine and feminine, and those that have more distinctions, further distinctions, for example, a neuter or neutral distinction will also favor the masculine form in the development of acquisition of those particular morphemes. He also talks about negation, that negation is a very slow and stage-like process as part of the acquisition process, and it can be very, very clearly defined in different stages, again, regardless of the language, regardless of the, if we're talking L2, regardless of the first language, that the development of negation will follow a very similar kind of pattern throughout languages. I'm just going to throw out a personal example because I have a daughter who's 2.5, and she fits right into the description that VanPatten gives here of how negation is acquired in English. She says, for example, I have to say, Holly, would you like to put your shirt on? And she will say, Holly want no shirt. And she is consistent. Holly want no yogurt. Holly want no breakfast. Holly want no walk. Holly want no video. So it's a very structured way, and it's going to be very slow, and before they finally get it right, and it goes through multiple stages. Same thing, the relative clauses are indications of much more complex language because we have embedding of noun phrases in longer complex sentences. And he, again, I'm not going to go into that because you can read it for yourself and it's very complicated. And Bill VanPatten says himself that it is a complex process, but again, there is order development in the use of relative clauses, and there is order development in what we might consider to be errors in the acquisition of relative clauses. He draws the example for an example that he gives is the resumptive pronouns, where I gave the book to him, to Bill. So again, repeating the object at the end of the sentence, or that is the book that I gave to Bill, to him. The repeating of the direct object at the end of the sentence. But I suggest that you go back and read that chapter on your own. Another example in the Spanish teaching world is the difference between ser and estar, two copular verbs. Verbs that both mean to be and are used in very different contexts for very different purposes. And this, again, is a very slow process. And ser, which is the verb that expresses existence, is going to be, again, the default for language, in language acquisition and for second language acquirers. And this has really big implications, particularly for Spanish teachers, where ser and estar becomes an issue in terms of why aren't the students understanding the difference between ser and estar, these two ways of talking about being, one for description, one for existence, and one for talking about feelings and location. Those are the sort of traditional textbook rules. Much more complex than that, but there is an order development, and ser will always be the default until both systems have been acquired. Tense and aspect refers to, of course, tense is referring to a time frame, past, present, future, and aspect is the actual more sort of detailed reference to time. Is it a completed action? Is it an action that is habitual? Is it an action in progress? And again, in terms of acquisition and order development, the past completed action is going to develop first before any other aspects of tense are going to be acquired. Question formation, again, is also subject to order development, as is the sound system. So his conclusion here, and Franzi, I can't remember if you have this on the next slide, but the conclusion that Bill VanPatten makes here is that language is humans acquire language in a very evolutionary stage-like process. There's an internal system that is being activated, and it is predictable, it is ordered, it is structured, and it takes time to grow. All humans are going to acquire at different rates and speeds, but they are not going to skip stages. They are not going to pass from the tadpole that's swimming in the water to suddenly become a frog. They must go through those stages, although some may pass through the stages more quickly than others. And I think the last sentence here, ordered development seems to permeate most of language acquisition in terms of these systems, morphemic, phonological, etc. Shall I continue, Franzi? Order development suggests that there is something internal to the human mind that pushes learners to develop language in a particular way.
Yeah, just like that marble works.
Yeah. And this is in spite of external factors, in spite of explicit instruction, despite L1, L2, there is an order that cannot be controverted.
Thank you. So yeah, what may obscure order development is that it happens in these stages, and there are no abrupt transitions, but rather overlapping stages that form a slow gradient climb, he says. Students acquire language at different rates, as Michelle already said, but never skip a stage. Variations occur within stages, but as Michelle said, tadpole is not going to suddenly grow arms when it still has when it's still in stage one. So that's another reason why this order development can be obscured, is because language acquisition has a U-shaped development. And I saw that in myself. I was recently taking a Spanish course and we were given these structures, and I was just like confidently talking, using these structures. And 20 minutes into this, I'm like, why am I so confident? Am I doing this right? Is there an S? Is there no S? I suddenly got all into my head, and I was just a bubbling mess. And eventually I acquired that confidence again, and I felt safe and secure and in my language acquisition. And you may see that U shape in your classroom with your students. In this third chapter, where we dive in a little bit deeper today, the authors talk about the basic ingredients of language acquisition, not language learning, but language acquisition. And they start off saying it's a little bit like baking a cake, only a little bit more complicated. So they talk about that there are internal ingredients and there are external ingredients that facilitate language acquisition. Let's begin with the internal ingredients. There are two internal ingredients that they highlight in the book, and they always say, there are volumes and mountains of books you can read where they go into much more depth, but this is what's relevant for the classroom teacher. They talk about language-specific mechanisms. It's the mechanism that is needed or required to build a linguistic system. It's that nitty-gritty grammar stuff. And he goes into universal grammar. And universal grammar can be summarized that languages are more alike than we may think. That languages adhere to some abstract and deep principles. And language is constrained and guided by that universal grammar. So when I did the review of language earlier on, I said, yeah, we're going to come back to this. That constraint, that slow, piecemeal, that constraint, that is because of universal grammar. It keeps things in check. So we have internal language-specific mechanisms in place, and then there are general, broader learning mechanisms in place. General learning mechanisms are in place when you're able to read these three images as birds. None of these images are actual living birds. The one to the very left is an AI-generated image. That bird does not exist, yet we recognize even the very abstract depictions as a bird. And that is thanks to general learning mechanisms. It's what allows us to learn vocabulary, build phrases, and recognize a bird as a bird and a cat as a cat. So these are the internal learning, the internal ingredients that the authors talk about. Let's flip over to the external ingredients, or EI for short. And here they talk about three essential pieces: input, interaction, and disposition. Let's look at them individually. Let's start with input. Input, the authors say, is the most fundamental external ingredient. That is where the rubber hits the road. Input is what language learners hear.
And shopping on January 29th, which is
okay, somebody needs to turn off their audio. Thank you. Input is what language learners hear or read in communicative context. And they say explicitly, input is not practiced or manipulated language. Them doing exercises, them moving words around on the page, that is not input. Input is what they hear and read. For language acquisition to occur, input, that all-important input, must be comprehensible. They must understand what is being said. Input must be communicatively embedded. So in a meaningful context, in a meaningful interaction. It is often, these comprehensible and communicatively embedded is often abbreviated as CCI, comprehensible, communicatively embedded input. And then the authors talk about the third element, frequency. We need to hear things over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Repetition, repetition, repetition. That's what matters. Input, when we provide input that is comprehensible, communicatively embedded, and frequent, language acquisition becomes possible. You cannot acquire a language you do not understand. You can learn a language you do not understand. It's called just random memorization of sound patterns, but you cannot acquire a language you do not understand. So as a language teacher, always make sure that everybody knows what is being talked about. Don't leave them guessing. However, comprehension does not guarantee acquisition. So you understand it, but that doesn't mean you necessarily acquire it yet, because we need to go back to repetition, repetition, repetition. CCI, comprehensible, communicatively embedded input that is frequent. Let's move to interaction. Very short and sweet. It's very intuitive. We get it because interaction is the most frequent way learners get exposed to comprehensible, communicatively embedded input, hopefully input that is frequent. Moving on to disposition, their last point. Disposition is the attitude, motivation, and self-perception of the student. Frequent, comprehensible, communicatively embedded input propels acquisition. But acquisition, yeah. Disposition encourages the learner to seek out that comprehensible, communicatively embedded input. It's the disposition that makes them go, I don't want to do this. I can't do this. I'm too stupid. Or this is fascinating. I want to learn more. Give me more. That's where disposition comes in. It encourages students to seek it out. But it's the communicatively, comprehensively embedded, I'm mixing it up here. It's the input that propels the acquisition. Now, here is the great news. Exactly for those students who may start to shut down or have shut down already. I'm too stupid. I can't do it. I don't have a brain for languages. Aptitude and working memory are not related to acquisition. And that is good news. Listen, kiddo, your IQ is very, very marginally correlated to your ability to learn languages. I saw a research that's not in this book, somewhere else. Only 16% of a person's IQ is correlated to how well and fast they can acquire a language. Not necessarily learn a language. We're talking about acquisition in this book. Aptitude, working memory, nope. You can do this. You can learn this. It is not related to acquisition. So in summary, the authors talk about internal and external ingredients, those language-specific mechanism, general learning mechanism, input, interaction, and disposition. Now, how does this apply to our classroom situation? The implication is we have something to say about input and interaction. That is where our power comes in. We can't do anything, not anything, but we can't do that much about a student's disposition. They come in with an attitude or they don't. I don't know what to do about language-specific mechanisms or general learning mechanisms. I have no power there. Where I have access and input, where I have something to say as an educator, is in the world of input. I can make sure that my students have comprehensible input. They know what is being said. They are following what's going on in the classroom. I can make sure that it is communicatively embedded. I can make sure that we have that repetition without flogging a dead horse, but that we have engaging, fun, frequent repetition that is comprehensible and communicatively embedded. And I can make sure that we have compelling interaction in the classroom. That is where I have access as a teacher to a world that is, 3/5 I can't do much about or anything about.
And that takes us to chapter 4, the centrality of implicit learning. And you may have had that student before who in the first week in September comes to you with a lovely, kind and warm smile on their face and they say, I forgot everything from last year. And we go, why? I provided these amazing worksheets and we had all these amazing activities. What happened? So the author starts us off right off the bat saying students may spend a good deal of time trying to learn material explicitly. But when it comes to language acquisition, however, it is increasingly clear that implicit learning plays the primary role. So the authors talk about explicit and implicit learning. So let's go and dive and analyze what that actually means. What is explicit? What is implicit? Explicit knowledge, well, nothing is left to the imagination. And explicit content, we've seen that before, parental advisory, watch out. Nothing is going to be held back. In the classroom, what explicit knowledge looks like is knowledge you can verbalize, either as a student or as a teacher. You can tell them everything there is to know about the passé composé, or how you conjugate, or how to use a star, and etc., etc. It is super explicit, is all spelled out in thick books. Implicit knowledge, on the other hand, you know it when you see it. It's a gut feeling. It's like, oh, do I put a comma here or not? My gut tells me no, the comma is not needed. I've just heard myself the other day say to my students, doesn't that hurt your ears when you put it that way? Oh, no, it doesn't. Not yet. It doesn't hurt your ears yet. So implicit knowledge is that gut feeling, that ear feeling we have about the language. It is the language that falls out of our mouths, that falls out of our students' mouths without editing, without holding back and rethinking what comes out of my mouth next. It's simply what the language that is there, what falls out of the mouth, what falls out of the pencil when they write. So I have a feeling that most of you on this call will say, yeah, this is where we want to be. This is the target. This is where the goal is at. This is what we want from our students, that they can just produce language that's comprehensible, that we understand they are capable communicators. This is what we want for them. However, at least in traditional language teaching, we teach languages like we teach math and science and history. We teach it explicitly. This is where, in traditional teaching, the energy so often goes. And behind that teaching is the assumption that explicit teaching translates over, or to explicit knowledge will eventually translate over to implicit knowledge. Spoiler alert, I'm going to jump to the very end of the chapter. and say, actually, that translation, that conversion from explicit knowledge to implicit knowledge does not happen. There is a firewall between these two ways of knowing languages. Explicit knowledge does not become implicit knowledge. But I'm a little bit ahead of myself, so let's go back to closer to the beginning. So we have explicit knowledge, we have implicit knowledge. We'll get back to where we were just at. So how is this knowledge created in the first place? Well, it is created through learning, through explicit learning and implicit learning. So explicit knowledge produces explicit learning, implicit knowledge produces implicit learning. So explicit learning is a conscious process, usually done with intention. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to get those verbs in the imparfait tonight. I'm going to master them. Implicit learning, on the other hand, also referred to as implicit mental representation, which takes us right back to chapter 1, is the construction of new cognitive structures and behaviors without conscious processes and without intention. We are, in other words, unaware of what we are learning, maybe even that we are learning. And this is, most of you will probably agree, is how we acquire our L1. Not many parents will sit their toddler in front of a board and conjugate verbs with them. Simply interact with them in an appropriate, engaging, compelling, repetitive, communicatively embedded manner. So they eventually acquire their L1, their first language. So the question now becomes, do we acquire our second or additional language implicitly as well? And this is where VanPatten and Simonson refer to the father of the input hypothesis, Dr. Stephen Krashen, who in the 70s and 80s posited, yes, we acquire our first language and all our additional languages implicitly as well. In fact, he said, language acquisition comes from input, not output, from comprehension, not production. In other words, output is a result of input plus comprehension. So when we see a student who is struggling with output, the answer is not to say, here, produce more output. The answer is, oh, I need to produce more input. I need to make sure they understand what's going on. This is how we eventually get output. Output is the fruit. Input plus comprehension is how we get there. So back to chapter 1. Language is an abstract, complex, implicit, mental representation that takes time to build. And now we're adding on top of that. Therefore, it is almost impossible for learning to be largely explicit in nature. So we're back to ordered development, chapter 2. Ordered development is immune to explicit teaching. We know that already. And the authors refer to Pieneman's teachability hypothesis that says we can't make learners do something they are not ready to do naturally. So we're back to that slide. We have that in traditional teaching, we have the assumption that when we have explicit knowledge, eventually, somehow, miraculously, that becomes implicit knowledge. But the authors are adamant and they say, no, those two do not communicate with each other. They are separate systems of knowledge. In other words, there cannot be an interface between explicit knowledge and implicit mental representation. Or put even more shortly, more bluntly, explicit knowledge cannot turn into implicit knowledge. It doesn't work like that. And the authors also acknowledge research on explicit, implicit teaching is fraught with problems, but, and they are summarizing some of that research, explicit instruction results in short-term effects for explicit knowledge. So yeah, if you have an explicit test for them, make sure you teach explicitly. But if you teach explicitly and you want implicit knowledge, you're going to probably run into a lot of frustration because, again, those two systems do not communicate. In addition, explicit teaching and learning can have negative consequences. And lastly, additional language learners can develop native-like knowledge of even highly complex phenomena without receiving instruction. People who learn in L2 without instruction can develop knowledge that is more native-like than the knowledge of people who learn in L2 with instruction. So there's almost like a magic happen. They can do stuff they never really learned. And that's what we see when we provide implicit knowledge and we provide access to implicit learning. So let's summarize 3 slides. We're almost there. I know this is heavy. This is heavy. 3 slides to summarize the book. Language is developed implicitly in our brain based on abstract data from communicatively embedded input. Okay, so again, we have that word implicit, abstract, communicatively embedded. Put another way, communicatively embedded input is the only fuel our brain can process to build language. We can fill learners' brains with lots of explicit rules, but this explicit knowledge is like vinegar in a gas tank. And I'm not a car person, so I actually had to think about and Google what happens if I put vinegar in a gas tank? Well, nothing. The car will not run. Nothing happens. Just like that, our brain also, it will be there and it can be called off or on explicitly, but it will not build implicit knowledge. Summary page 2. The ultimate goal in language acquisition is to develop an implicit language system. So when we go teaching, we are there to help our students develop an implicit language system. The standard assumption should be that implicit learning is central in acquisition and explicit learning plays a limited role. We're not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater, or what they're saying is don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we should be teaching from a place that says, I have to provide input that is compelling, communicatively embedded, that is frequent, and that is comprehensible, because implicit learning is central to acquisition. Summary 3. Summary C3 says, yeah, we have these internal mechanisms or ingredients, we have these external ingredients, but where we as educators have a say is when it comes to input and interaction. We make sure they understand what's going on. And when students in my class don't understand what's going on, I say, you know what? If you don't understand what's going on, you're not acquiring language. So everybody stops. We're stopping the class right here. We make sure that you understand what is going on. Every single soul in my classroom. We make sure that it's communicatively embedded, that we have that repetition while make it compelling.